Good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from in the world today. Today is the International Day of Visibility, and I have the great pleasure to welcome two of the most vocal trans leaders in America today, particularly when it comes to the corporate world. First, I have my very good friend Stephanie Battaglino, who just published a book, and we are going to have the opportunity to speak about this book. And her book talks about her journey through corporate America, so it is particularly relevant to out leadership. And then Jennifer Hurley, a close friend of mine too, who has been a huge champion for trans rights in the United States. She leads in particular Trans New York, an organization that is gaining a lot of momentum in the community. And so I am extremely honored to have both of you on our show today. So welcome and thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fabrice. Thanks for having me.
So Stephanie, let's jump right in. You've published a book, a tell-all about your life.
There it is.
So can you tell us a little bit about, first of all, can you tell us about the title? Can you tell us who is the publisher, where we can get the book, and also why you decided to go ahead and tell your story?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, Fabrice, and I'll be happy to do that. Thank you. The book actually comes out on May 11th, but it's available for pre-order right now. The the title of the book is Reflections from Both Sides of the Glass Ceiling, Finding My True Self in Corporate America. And it's a book that's been, swirling in my head for like the last 5 years, I guess. I think I started writing it in earnest right after the Pulse massacre in June of 2016. While I didn't lose any people there specifically, it just really disturbed me on a very deep level. And I knew that, it was important to add my voice in some manner to that. And the way I chose to do that was, I learned a long time ago, um, when I first came out, which was 15 years ago now, it was 2005, um, that there's power in our stories, and that when we try to move the needle in a positive direction on trans and non-binary workplace inclusion and just equality generally inside and outside of the workplace, that all we really have to do is tell our stories. And really that's what the book is. The book is a collection of stories. It's not just my origin story of where I grew up in northern New Jersey and that sort of thing. I mean, it's very memoir like in that regard, but it takes you all the way through my journey through corporate, which for the first 25 years of my 40-year career, I was a white male. And then I decided to come out, and then everything changed. So I talk all about that and what it was like coming out and what it was like, because I was the first trans person in the history of New York Life Insurance Company, where I worked for my last 20 years of my career. I was the first trans person to come out in the history of the company. And in 2005, that's like 160 years. So, I thought I was going to get fired. I thought they were going to run me out of town on a rail, because that's what happened to trans people when they came out. We were making early strides with trans workplace inclusion in 2005, but we certainly weren't there yet. I mean, there weren't the hundreds of companies now that you see on the Corporate Equality Index that have perfect scores of 100. Not back then. There were some, of course, certainly not at New York Life. And I thought, being a conservative life insurance company, forget it. But it turned out that they didn't fire me. It was more about how can we make this transition as comfortable as we can for you? And it was really out of that, leading them by the hand, because they didn't know what to do, that I realized what my true calling is. Over time, I realized it was for me to add my voice. And the best place that I knew to do that was in the corporate space, because I knew how to navigate in those spaces because I had been in corporate for so many years, and that's really what set me on this journey. And I talk about all of that in the book. And
Yeah, and so having a book and talking about your journey is particularly important because visibility is a key issue for trans people, right? In
indeed,
many ways, the reason why there is an international day, Trans Day of Visibility, is because for a lot of Americans, they have never met or worked with a trans person. So one of my questions will be, Stephanie, are you working to try to get your story and your book to the people that might never have experienced an encounter with a trans person?
that's part of it. And the other part of it is raising up the voices of my trans siblings that aren't in a place to raise their own voice. Because my feeling always is you raise up your voice, you're raising up all the other voices with you. You're kind of raising the waterline. And I think that's what the Day of Visibility is all about. It's changing the narrative, it's expanding the narrative, it's changing the narrative, it's making people very aware that trans people are, we walk among you, but we're also, contributing members of society, whether that be within the corporate world or outside of the corporate world. And it's time that our journeys be celebrated and included in the larger narrative inside and outside of the workplace.
Yeah,
That's why I
so,
did the
and so
book.
Stephanie, we're going to come back to some of the things that you mentioned in the book,
Sure.
which were very surprising to me. But I would like to bring in Jen in the conversation. First, I should mention that you and Jen are very close, and I think one time you describe each other as sisters from another mother or something along those lines. But Jen, your journey is quite different from Stephanie
Yes.
because you only transitioned very recently. And so, I know you a little bit personally. You're someone that is very upbeat, and you definitely do not look at life from the point of view of self pity or complaining. But my question to you is: do you have any regret that you transitioned later in life than Stephanie did?
Um, Actually, I'm hard pressed to find regrets. I look at things a little differently than a lot of trans people do. Maybe came out later. I had a full life. I had a full life as a male. I did not hate my life. I wasn't as happy as I am now. So I don't regret that part of my being. Um, but because I came out so late in life, I feel I have a lot to catch up on. So that's why I'm pushing myself out there as far as I possibly can to make a difference in the community. And also, it's made a difference for me. I think one of the things that has made it somewhat that I've been surprised by was the ease of initially the fear was like no other fear before. But once I came out and I opened up my nonprofit, things just seemed to really go much easier for me. I really had no time to reflect on it. I've had some ups and downs, with families, but I guess if I would say I had one regret was, living two lives really was the most difficult part for me. I was married for 35 years. I was, living a lie in that way. Um, and then, living two lives, having to hide yourself, not being able to be the person who you are. And, although I came out late in life, I've talked to you about that. I had these feelings since I was a child. So these feelings never have left me. You know, it was always inside of me. That's why I believe this is innate. It's sure there's a decision piece of it about when to do it. But I think once somebody discovers that they have some type of gender identity issue, I don't think these things just magically go away. They stay with you and either you work through it and become that authentic person, or maybe you don't.
Yeah, I will ask you to mute when you're not speaking because I think I hear a tiny little bit of an echo, but minimal. But to come back to that question, first of all, I love the fact we Jen, your point of view on life, which is that you had a fuller life and it's just basically a different page of your life, but also the fact that you regret a little bit the ambiguity of having two lives. I'll tell you, as a gay man, I felt very unlucky at the beginning of my life, and then now I kind of make sense of it by thinking of all the opportunities to have a rich life that came from being gay. I would probably still be living in the guest bedroom of my parents if it wasn't for the fact that I had to move away to the United States so that I could have a relationship with boys, and I was very good at it, so I never came back. But but my question to you, Stephanie and Jane, is how do you make sense of the fact that you were born with a different gender identity than the one you were assigned at birth? How do you make sense of it in the wider context of life? Is it something like my experience in which you think, well, it has allowed me to live a richer life, or is it something you never think about? That's a bit of a difficult question, I have to say.
Well, the way I look at it, I think the best way for me to answer that, Fabrice, is to say what I typically say these days, which is I am blessed. I consider myself blessed to live a life in two genders. I mean, there's a lot of, so for me, it was 40 plus years of shame, guilt, and denial. So that dissonance, that discordance, I ran from it. And I talk about this in the book. I ran from it. I hid from it. I did everything that would not give away the fact that I was different than all the other boys. So I threw myself into sports and all of those sorts. That was a big outlet for me. And it was all about hiding. It was all about hiding. But once you reach a point where you can't hide anymore, you have to make some decisions, I think, about, and I think every trans person, to some degree and in their own way, reach that same decision point. What we're seeing now, it's happening earlier and earlier and younger. But for me, and in my generation, mine and Jen's generation, it's a lot of later in life transitions. So that means you had to deal with all of this stuff before you have that authentic moment and say, no, I have to embrace who I really know myself to be, and deal with the consequences, quite honestly, of having created this kind of house of cards life as a man. Now I've gained a lot in my life, and in those years that I lived it as my male self. And some of that I bring along with me. My former name was Michael, and I often say, there's elements of Michael that are still within, my soul. I mean, it's and I take that with me. Whether it's my sense of humor or whatever, those things come along with me. I don't necessarily feel like I have to kind of eradicate all of that from my life, because now I'm living my life truly authentically as me, as the person you see before you. So that's how I choose to look at it, and how I choose to carry that experience with me throughout my life as me.
Well, it's really powerful to hear you say it's a blessing. Jen, do you consider that being transgender is a blessing?
I do. And I agree with a lot what Stephanie said. I think that, what happens is you do come to a point where, you're wishing this thing away. You don't want it to be, because society doesn't understand. But you can run, but you can't hide from yourself. It never leaves you, that feeling. The feeling stays with you. So with me, since I have a PhD, and I've been working with a psychoanalyst, oh goodness, for 25 years on myself, for personal development. Emotionally, I had to work through those things. And I was actually helping people transition while I was in the closet.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, you didn't know that. Yes.
No.
I had a counseling business for 3 or 4 years before, a better life counseling business, that's what I called it. And I helped trans people deal with their gender identity issues when I couldn't come out on my own. And I wasn't really fully aware of it, you know. And, you know, like Stephanie said, I'll remember this day forever. May 1st, 2017. I woke up in the morning, I looked around and I asked myself, what the hell am I doing? Because I had a beautiful bedroom that nobody could go in. My daughter was living. And I couldn't live that life outside of that room unless I went to a conference or something like that. So, and I agree with Steph that, you know, there's elements of me, you know, with family, you know, I think emotions when you're on this journey, it's just like life, you know, you have your ups and downs. My own sister, who was pretty good when I first came out, I called and I was sharing some pictures with her and she started to cry. And I said to her, her name is Liz. I said, Liz, what's wrong? Why are you crying? And my male name was Tim. And she said, well, I just missed him so much. You know, I just feel like I lost somebody. And I said to her, I said, it's okay for you to feel that you have to grieve, but I'm letting you know that some of that person is still here. It's inside of me. I haven't changed that way, you know, but you have to understand that symbolically in families, especially and with friends, people, you know, me being her brother was symbolic of something else. Maybe it was a father figure. Maybe it was a friend, you know, she lost that, you know, and she needed to talk about that. So I think sometimes, you know, we have to give people their space. But, you know, I talk about this with clients because I work with clients all the time when it comes to surgery, for example. You know, all the shots, all the pills, all the injections, sure, they do things for you, but they're not going to help you if you don't work on what's on the inside. Working on the inside for a trans person, or any person for that matter, is really the most important thing to do. And, you know, I can't just throw away everything that I had for 56 years and say there was nothing. I mean, I wouldn't have had a daughter. I wouldn't have had a marriage. I mean, those were experiences that were, well, the daughter was great. I'm not sure. Now, my ex-wife may see this, but parts of the marriage at the end got a little rough. So, but, you know, there are times it was a good marriage. So,
well, I have to say that both of your positivism is also a bit of an inspiration. You know, I was sharing this morning that I just watched a movie called Summer '85 about two boys that love each other in their teenage year. And you know, there is always a part of me, because I came out so late in life, there is a part of me that regrets not having lived a romantic life when I was a teenager, right? Until I was 22, everything was, you know, burdened with shame and disgust, and you know, and there is a part of me that is really happy to see things getting better for the next generation. But I also have a bit of grief from the fact that love, you know, was always something problematic rather than something beautiful or worthy. And so I love your outlook on this. You know, another question that I will ask you is, you know, and it's a bit of a broad question. You don't have to answer if you feel that you don't have an answer. But what do you think is the purpose of trans people for humankind? You know what I mean? Why is it part of the creation? Is it something you ever think about?
No, my first answer, I don't mean to be glib, Fabrice, is, well, you might have to ask God that question. Because, you know, for the longest time, and I consider myself a very spiritual person, and I think, you know, a lot of the two-spirit community very much embraces the trans community because, again, we embrace the spirit and the essence of both of the feminine and of the masculine. And, you know, for the longest time, you know, and I don't necessarily mean to drag religion into this, but I was raised a Roman Catholic. So part of the shame and guilt and denial that I heaped upon myself had everything to do with the fact that, you know, I was in the I was in church on every Sunday, beating my breast, like, and it's like, why? But, over time you realize, well, God doesn't make mistakes. We're all divine children of God. And I just think that, and as a result, there is a place for us on this earth because we have a larger a larger message to send to those that want to hear it, about inclusion, about living authentically, about creating your own path in the world. That's what I believe.
Jane, what do you think?
Well, I've thought about this quite a bit, actually. I think it's a great question. And some of what Stephanie, I believe as well. But I would say this, that, and it may seem a little radical, but I do believe I was sent. And I think that all trans people are sent, and minorities and other people. Because at the end of the day, if we actually believe, that we have souls, right? Then this is just an outer shell. And this is an experience and a teaching for others, no matter how hard it is, no matter how long it takes, you know? So I think the universe, sends beings here to help teach us. And then we teach and we get to another level. I believe a little in reincarnation, and we come back. And the soul goes up and up until it reaches whatever level that is. I'm not really sure how that all works, but I do believe that, that trans people, just like gay people, just like minorities, have been sent to be in these particular situations so people can see it, so we can go through the experiences, so we can learn, and so others can learn by it. That's my spiritual feeling on the whole thing. So I'm fascinated by the question, and I do think about it a lot.
So let's step back from God for a minute and come back to human beings. One of the things which is amazing about your experience, Stephanie, is that you talk about the fact that the first thing you realized as a trans woman was how horrendous misogyny is. And that basically you found yourself in some ways kind of the victim of misogyny that you might have practiced without even knowing it before your transition. So can you tell us a little more about how you came to realize this, and why it was a bit of a shock?
Sure. It's like I was carrying, as a white male in corporate America. I had worked at AT&T for 10 years before I joined New York Life, and banks before that. So progressing up through the corporate ladder as a white male, I had this thing called male privilege that came along for the ride. I wore it like a backpack, across my shoulders. But I have to say, it wasn't anything that I actually thought about every single day. But I certainly, bore the fruit of the advantages that it gave me, right? So I go through my career, with this intact, and for all I know, over the years, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, how it opened doors for me that perhaps remained closed to my cis female colleagues. But I didn't even think about that. I was more laser focused on my career progression at the time. So then I come out, and and by and large, the whole transition experience at New York Life went very, very well. I work with some amazing people and I worked with in a very collegial environment. So, so then all of a sudden, how it reared its ugly head was that I didn't have it anymore. So here I am going into these meetings. I was managing a group of like 30 people. And so I was always doing reports and doing readouts in conference rooms and all this other kind of stuff to senior members and of the leadership team. And, I never really thought much of it, but suddenly I was being questioned, and a little mansplaining is going on. All these little microaggressions were like suddenly showing up, and I'm like, what is going on here? And it's like, so here I am trying to get my feet level on the ground as a woman trans woman in the workplace. So I had the whole gender identity thing going on. I was still, living into myself, as I like to say. But then I was getting bombarded with all of this. And I'm like, am I working with just a bunch of like crazy transphobic people? That can't be it, because they're so supportive of me. And then it dawned on me, they're not reacting this way to me because I'm trans. They're acting this way to me because they see me as yet another woman in the workplace. And in that particular culture, which I think is an important caveat to add here, that's how I was treated. Could have been very different if I was at some like, startup on the West Coast in San Francisco somewhere where you bring your skateboard to work. That might have been a little different deal, but that's how it showed up. And what's also an important part of that story, I think, Fabrice, is how did I react to that? Well, I was socialized as a male in corporate America for 25 years. So what was I socialized to do? To
You punch
defend
them in the
myself.
face. You punch them in the face.
Well, the Italian in me, sometimes I got to hold back, Fabrice. I'm just saying. But Jen's laughing, she knows. But I defended myself, and I defended myself rather vociferously. And I tell the story in the book where that one such meeting happened, and one of my cis colleagues who worked for me, she's like, "Steph, you got a minute? Come here. I got to talk to you." I'm like, "Sure." So we go in my office, close the door, and she says, "What did you just do in there?" And I said, "Well, I defended myself, of course. They were attacking me." And she goes, "I could never do that." I'm like, "What do you mean you can never do that?" She goes, "Oh, I wasn't raised that way. I was raised to essentially acquiesce and just, smooth over it and let it go." And I'm thinking, wow. And that's really kind of where it hit me between the eyes, Fabrice. I was like, this is a whole different kettle of fish, if you will. And that's how I knew that I was suddenly had crossed over and was on the other side of the glass ceiling. And but it's how I was accepted by my cis female colleagues, all the other women that I worked with, as just another member of the team, another member of the group. And I learned a lot from those women and how they had to juggle and how they worked so hard um, to um, to build their careers and to also, for many of them, maintain their family life. I always tell the joke, it's like, so the good news is I fully assimilated into the female workforce of my workplace. The bad news is I fully assimilated into the female workforce
That's funny.
of my company.
Actually, it kind of brings me to a question, because what you're touching upon is hegemonic masculinity and the fact that, now there's a lot of talk about the fact that men kind of ignore the fact that they are attached to their dominance in society, right?
Mhm.
And one of the theory that I have heard is that a lot of the rejection of trans people, which sometimes is violent, right, in how in a way more violent than the rejection of homosexuals, and that it is because for someone who is biologically male to decide to have a female gender identity is a huge threat to hegemonic masculinity, right? Why would anybody that has the chance to be a man would want to be a female, right? That kind of threatens that concept of hegemonic masculinity. Do you think that this explains in part why there is such a violent pushback on the visibility of trans people?
Uh, Go ahead, Jen. You can go.
Well, what I was going to say was, I guess that plays a part, but I think sexism, plays a real large part in the way women are viewed in society. It's interesting what Steph was talking about. When I wrote my dissertation, the title of it was Perceptions of Role Conflict and Workplace Stress in Women Working in Male-Dominated Professions. So I think with the change of gender, and it's very interesting if you think about it, you rarely hear about female to male. Always seems to be this emphasis on male to female transgender individuals. So even as when a female transitions to male, she still can't get the, or now he can't get the respect even. It's still, they're still invisible. And I actually, in my practice, 65 to 70% of the people who come to see me or speak to me are female to male.
Oh,
So
well.
to me, it's fascinating that, that occurs. The second thing that occurs is that I think when it comes to, in particular to when we see the murder of transgender people of color, some of those people are sex workers. The very idea that someone's going to visit a sex worker and they don't know this person's gender is so ridiculous, it's not even funny. Anyone who goes to seek out a sex worker knows what type of person that is and knows how they identify. So what happens is they just can't deal with it. So they get angry and they explode. That doesn't, there's no justification for those things. But I think that, you know, it's interesting why, there's so much male privilege. Why would somebody do this? And as Stephanie said, what's kind of interesting sometimes, I get lost in myself. Like Stephanie talked about her own personal story, where I forget that, yes, I'm a transgender woman, but I'm still doing things with the male white privilege that I had, because it just, what's inside of me, what I've learned my whole life. So I think that, I think the idea really revolves more around sexism. And I also think there's anthropology to deal with it. I think that, visually, if we see somebody, we know like attraction, typically according to anthropologists, a male will seek out a female with larger hips and a smaller waist. That's, that's for having babies, for making children, for reproduction. So I think there's a variety of reasons why that is, but I do think what you say plays into it. I think that people, really can't understand why someone would do it. And I think, as I said, visually, I think it's very difficult for people to accept, and I think gender is a very difficult concept for anyone to understand, and that's why we are doing so much education with corporate and schools, and Stephanie's writing books and all kinds of things.
Yeah. So another question I have for you, Jen, is about trans people and sexual orientation, right? One of the things that you told me is that it was more difficult for your family to accept that you were in a relationship with another trans woman than to accept that you were trans. And I have to say that very often I tend to be a bit surprised when I talk to trans people to realize that sometimes, I mean, pretty often, trans women are still in a relationship with the wife that they had when they had not transitioned, right? And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about why you think it was difficult for people to accept you were in a relationship with another woman, and also uh, why you think there is this assumption that trans women are going to be in relationship with men.
I mean, that's, it's interesting. I think, for myself, I only came out, 3 years ago, and then a year later, I met Nancy, my fiance. So I think, what you say is correct. I think that, they were starting to accept this, and, in their mind, since that's how their binary and sexual orientation works, they said, okay, well, if she's a she, now she's going to be with a male, you know, and it just didn't work out that way. I mean, I had really no idea what I would do, to be frank. I was thinking about males. No offense to you, Fabrice, but well, you're a doll. But men in general, I'm not attracted to, so I can say that. Um, but I think for my family, they were just so bowled over by the fact that, not only did they have one trans person, but now they had two, to sort of deal with. So
And Nancy's a lot to deal with.
yes, and Nancy's a lot to deal with.
Watch
you know
what you say,
on
Jen. Watch what you say.
yeah, I know. Well, I tell her all the time she's a lot to deal with. But you know, on the on the visibility issue, one of the things that's really had helped myself uh, with being out so much is being with Nancy, because she's very outright. We go everywhere and anywhere. I mean, I live in a middle class uh, Trump town, um, so nobody gives us a hard time. We go everywhere we want. We celebrate. We hold hands, and it's been quite an amazing experience. So I think that, I think that people get stuck in the narratives of binary, and I think that people get stuck in the narratives of sexuality, even though, is LGBTQ plus, for the average person, they think every man should be with a woman and every woman should be with a man, and that's just the way it should be.
Mhm.
So I think when it came to me announcing this, they really struggled with this. So,
And
go
and you
ahead.
know what this gets to, Fabrice, is it's the notion, it's the two concepts of gender identity and sexual orientation. For the uninitiated, they tend to put the two together when in fact they are independent variables. Because when they put it together, what I was getting when I was coming out by those that did not know were, so Steph, you're trans, so you're gay, right? Well, the answer is maybe. It's not a fait accompli necessarily. Gender identity.
Great use of the French.
Fabrice, I had to suck up somehow. I mean, come on. So, it's the whole notion of gender identity, my internal sense of what my gender is, and then sexual orientation, who I'm attracted to, independent variables on a to Jen's point, on somewhat of a sliding scale. We do not live in a binary world, which is hard for many folks that perhaps don't know anything about the trans community and the non-binary community to kind of wrap their head around.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's gender identity is who I am, and sexual orientation is who I love. And so for me, when I came out, I had to kind of like come out twice. So I come out to my family as trans, and if that wasn't bad enough, just run myself over the coals one more time, because when I met my wife, Mari, who happens to be a trans woman, so that's like, so I'm a lesbian, yippee. So so I'm coming out again to my family, and they're like, and you know what? The funny thing was, I mean, they came around to my being trans, but I think what might have been harder for like my sister was the whole lesbian thing. I think it kind of blew her mind when I was, she's like, so you're a lesbian? Because her thought was, well, you went through your gender confirmation surgery and all that kind of stuff. You did that so you could be with a man, right? And I'm like, no, wrong answer. That is not why. And, but that's part of the education process, quite frankly, Fabrice.
And what I love also about social media is that, I get to see a little bit your relationship, Jen, with Nancy. And I think that there is a bit the same thing that happens with us gay people, which is that you see the banality of our experience, right? Like your relationship with Nancy is a love story that is that is exactly comparable to a straight people love story or a gay people love story. And in many ways, I think that's part of visibility, is that when people get to know us, they realize that we share we share that humanity, that human experience, which is love, grief, fears about our career, and and that's the power of visibility. But I wanted to come back to, and I really want to talk, Stephanie, also about the corporate world, because I have, it's very relevant to our leadership, and a very concrete question that you do address in the book. But before that, something that really struck me, Jen, is that you said we go everywhere. With Nancy, we go everywhere. And I have to tell you that even though I'm supposed to work today, I went on a 40 minutes bike ride with the twins in that new place I live in Connecticut. And I was on my bike, and suddenly I was thinking, well, maybe I have a bit too much jewelry, right? Because I have a necklace, I have a bracelet, and I was like, maybe I have too much jewelry for where I live. And what it means to me is that the weight of the way people look at me is still very important to me. right? I'm like, in my mind, I was like, are people in the neighborhood going to see that I'm a gay guy? Do I look like a gay guy, right? That crossed my mind. Not that I care that much, but it crossed my mind. And so what I wanted to ask you, Stephanie and Jen, is does the way people look at you as trans people still matter to you, or you've become completely immune to the reaction of people to who you are?
Um, I would say for me, I don't think the feeling ever goes away that people are looking. I think you do. I've done a lot of work. I've become a lot less self-conscious. I think if we all, realize, as I said before, if I was 7 feet tall as a male, people would look at me. If I was 500 pounds, people would have a tend to look at me. I happen to be a 6 foot tall woman. I'm not a small person. So I generally don't get misgendered in public, but I think that people do look sometimes. But for the most part, I think that most people are in their own world doing the same things that we're all doing, worrying about our kids, our jobs, paying taxes, you know, what's happening at home, what do we have to do, our family's health, all those things. I think if we realize, and the more, and that's why for Nancy and I, being with Nancy, going out so much has been really a fantastic experience because we hold hands. I mean, we're, and I'm not shy to say this, we're madly in love with one another. And it's really one of the best relationships I've ever had. So we're not shy to go to I mean, these are not transgender restaurants, so, we hold hands and sometimes we kiss and that's what we do. But for the most part, I don't think, most people are, paying too much attention to us. Sometimes they do. But for the most part, I try and work on myself to know that. And for me being a big person, I'll tell you a personal story. I don't wear heels a lot because I'm so tall. So, but now I'm starting to work on that, and I'm working on there's gender dysphoria that we have, or some people have who are trans, but there's also body dysmorphia that everybody suffers from. Doesn't matter who you are, male, female, gay, straight, whatever, we all have an image of our bodies that we may or may not like. And usually there's things we don't like about ourselves. And I'm a realist, there's certain things I can change and certain things I can't. I'll never be 5'5". Not gonna happen. So I think that, when I
You
go
never know.
into
You never know, because I went from 5'7" to 5'6". But
you would think I'd get a little thinner after Nancy runs me around, but that hasn't happened.
and you, Stephanie, do you pay attention to the way people perceive you, or not?
Not anymore. I'm not fooling anybody. A friend of mine said that once. It's like, I'm not fooling anybody. I am who I am. I had to live to that. I had to live into that. I mean, in the beginning, and I talk about this in the book, it's especially at work. It's, I felt like I'd come into work and I had 10,000 sets of eyes looking right at me and only me, nobody else. As part of that is like, Steph, just get over yourself. It's not all about you. But in the beginning, that's really how I felt. And I think it's important to just kind of take this and bifurcate it a little bit to, how did I feel in the corporate world, and then, in my personal life? Because, for me, it was very important once I came out, and in the corporate world, to very much look the part. I was a corporate vice president. I was an appointive officer of my company. I felt very strongly that it was very important for me to look the part. Whether that was a really nice business suit with either slacks or a skirt and heels, that's that, made sure the hair was right, the whole bit. That's how I comported myself, because I felt in my role as a corporate vice president, especially when I had this unit of 30 people, that it was very important for me to dress the part, um, because I thought it would help kind of bridge that gap with that, that wacky behavior I was talking about before, about the loss of male privilege. So yeah, was I compensating a little bit? Absolutely, I was. Absolutely, I was, and I freely admit that. Um, Outside in my personal life, it's in the beginning. Yeah, I was still getting my my sea legs, if you will, and and I would be conscious of those around me. But my credo always was, and always still is, you lead with a smile, and 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 I disarm people with it, unless they're really bitter and they hate me, and that's their deal, not mine. And then I met my wife and fell in love with my wife, Mari, who happens to be a 6'2" tall, blonde trans woman. And it's like she proudly goes everywhere, always has. So it's like when the two of us show up, here I am at 5'9" on a good day, and she's 6'2". It's like, well, here we are, and we love to travel. We've been on cruises, and we love to cruise, back when it was okay in the before times. And yeah, we were the only trans couple on the cruise. It wasn't like a gay cruise or a lesbian cruise or anything. And it's like, so you do a little outreach along the way when you're on vacation. It comes along for the
Yeah,
ride.
but I have to say that both you and Jen share a very go-getter attitude. You're both introspective, um, and you are both outgoing, and you seem to have a solid emotional state. But do you think for do, don't you think that for other trans people it might be harder to face the burden of transphobia, the burden of misogyny, um, and what you describe also, which is sometimes tensions with the family and sometimes loss of job? Because Stephanie, you also talk about the fact that your career took a hit, that in many ways, in many ways, it was harder after you transition in the private sector. So my question to both of you is do you believe that you are the exception that managed to overcome the obstacles that face trans people in society and in the workplace? Or do you think that this is accessible to all trans people, your experience, which is a positive experience? You both managed to make a living, you both are in a loving relationship, you both found a voice to share your experience with the world and say, look, we are here and our experience is relatable on a human basis. But do you feel you are an exception, or do you feel this is something that is accessible to all trans people?
I, Fabrice, I would say that we're the exceptions, although there are others, but I think there's a pretty large majority that are struggling. I know that because I speak to people all the time through our mental health platform. So people are really struggling. It is hard to find work and not be afraid if you come out and work that you're going to get fired. It's fearful to try and go for an interview and maybe not have your name change yet, but this is the way you feel inside and you like to do it. So I think that many people are struggling. I think that corporations, uh, as you pointed out when we started today, they don't really have the tools and they have not really gone the distance for trans work inclusion. It's new, and a lot of times they don't even know someone who's trans or non-binary, non-conforming. So I think for the average trans person, and this is when we talk about the average trans person, we have to kind of put it in perspective because a large part of the trans community is marginalized. So that that segment of the community is really up against the wall. I'm talking about, that marginalized community, people of color. It's very problematic for them to get anywhere in life. I think the average annual wage of a person of color who's a trans woman is $10,000 a year. I mean, it's criminal that that goes on. And as I said, I think that corporations is one of my reasons why I'm keep pushing this, is that corporations really have to, if we can't always rely on government. We had government before Biden came into office, we had Trump. That was a disaster for trans people. So we have to get everyone in on this. We have to develop allies. We have to work within our community with LGBTQ+. We have to team up with women. We have to team up with all sorts of different allies. So we can push workplace inclusion out there and make lives better for trans people. So many people are suffering. I always quote this statistic to you. Attempted suicide rate of trans people, 42% on average. The average person in the US attempted suicide, I think is like 8%. And if we break that down to Hispanic, I think it jumps up to about 50. And if we go to African American, it jumps up to 55%. It is so ridiculous that I can even say it is the saddest thing. These are actually crimes against humanity. That's really what they are, Fabrice. We have to do something about this. This attempted suicide, is just unbelievable, unconscionable, and it's hard for me to fathom how people don't know this. This is the message that should be sent out to everyone. Enough about sports, and I know sports is important. Enough about the bathrooms. People are dying. People are taking their lives because they're not being accepted and they can't get into a job. Sad.
And to tag on to that, Jen, if I may, and why is that? It's because they feel as if there's no hope. They don't have any hope. We all deserve to have hope in our lives. We do. And my feeling is, I always say when I speak, I am speaking from my own experience. The vast majority of the trans community do not have it like Jen and I do. We are the fortunate ones. There's no question about that. But if my message and our message of overcoming obstacles and raising up our voice can make it better for the more marginalized elements of our community, then that's what we have to do. That's our mission in life. That's what we need to do. We need to raise up those voices like I talked about earlier. Excuse me. And it all begins and ends, and to my way of thinking, because I've been doing trans workplace inclusion work for the last 15 years, it all begins and ends with if you have a job. So we have to create workplaces where trans people are not only included, but celebrated for the contributions that they make to their enterprise.
And that, Stephanie, brings me to a question I have for you that we have
Sure.
discussed a little bit together before, which is that a lot of companies are like, okay, well, look, I have hired that trans person and they feel they have accomplished the trans inclusion process.
Mm-hmm.
But then after a year, and it's kind of anecdotal because I don't know that many trans people, but my anecdotal experience is that after a year, the trans individual that was hired by the company is not happy and is looking outside of the company, or that there is some level of conflict in the team. Have you ever thought about this idea that companies are focusing so much on hiring and so little on retention?
Mm-hmm.
And what can companies do, and why is it not the end of the journey to hire a trans person?
I talk about this in the book, Fabrice, and it was actually the original book before it became kind of more about my journey and other things. The term I like to use a lot, and I do in a lot of my talks and in my trainings, is moving from policy to practice in the corporate space as it pertains to trans workplace inclusion. In the very beginning, when it was very, very important that EEO policies and non-discrimination policies included protections for trans and non-binary folks across the dimension of gender identity, and in some cases also gender expression. So that's great. But to your point, that helps on the front end of the equation for attracting top talent from an ever diversifying pool of talent. So it's attraction, retention, or recruiting, and then onboarding and retention. It's toward the end where we're missing. And that's why I talk about moving from policy to practice. I have been on HRC forums, on panels where I've said, look, you can't rest on your HRC 100 score. You can't rest on your laurels. You've only have half the job done. It's what do you do to take these policies and imbue them into the culture of your company? That has everything to do with language, that has everything to do with communication, that has everything to do with including trans and non-binary people in other aspects of the company, of the corporate space, like um, promotion opportunities, leadership programs, all those things, work rotation, in some companies, it's important that people move around from assignment to assignment. You're considered a high performing manager. If that's how it was like in AT&T when I was there back in the 90s, that's how you moved around. That's how you were seen as high performing. Trans people need to be included in all of that, just like all the other underrepresented communities that are a part of a company's workforce. So it's finishing that equation. It's filling that equation out, Fabrice, which I think really is what full workplace inclusion looks like. The policy part's great. The 100 score and the corporate equality index, yippee, great for your marketing. I get it. I was in marketing for 40 years. But where do we go from there? What do we do differently? And that's where we have to push the envelope. And that's where culture is a big determinant, because how far you can push the envelope on workplace inclusion for trans and other individuals as well has everything to do with being able to read the culture of your company. So it's about communication, it's about culture, and it's about continual education. It's always because the needs of education are great. I thought when I first started doing this activism work, that, in 10 years, I wouldn't need to be doing this anymore because everybody would be on board. Everybody'd be woke. Boy, was I wrong. Um, the need for education just continues, and it just seems to self-perpetuate. And it's the companies that are on board with that thinking are the ones that are going to be successful in this space. And you know why? And then I'll get off my soapbox, Febreze, I promise. And the reason why they're going to be successful is because this top talent that I'm talking about might be the queerest person you've ever seen. They identify as queer or a trans person or whatever. They may be the most amazing IT person that ever walked out of MIT. And if you don't know how to deal with that individual and meet them where they are in the recruiting and then in the onboarding process, they're going to turn around and walk away from your company and go to your competitor that does know how to. And that's where they're going to, and that individual is going to work with that company, and they're going to have a competitive advantage over you in your industry segment down the road. That's why it's important, because you multiply that. It's not just one person, it's others and others and others. And that's really how I feel. And I think that's where we need to go, and we still need to go there.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, Stephanie, I'm the first one that loves the economic and the talent argument, right? Because in many ways, that's the reason, that's the way gay men have managed to carve a pretty comfortable niche for themselves in the workplace. But don't you think that on work issue, there is it comes back on trans issue, right? It comes back a little bit to what Jen said, which is as a society, don't we have also an obligation to respond to the need of trans people, irrespective of whether it's the good economic thing to do, or whether it's going to make better profit for the company by attracting talent? I mean, there is also a part of what is our duty to people that basically are victimized by the binary society we have created, right? I mean, you know what I mean? And that actually brings me to another question for you, Jen and Stephanie, which is that everybody knows that the LGBTQ plus organization in the United States, which have been extremely successful, tend to be gay white dominated, right? And in many ways serve our purpose. And my question to you is, do you feel that those organizations are doing enough for trans people? And also, do you feel that the trans civil society, meaning the organization battling for trans rights and promoting equality for trans people, are strong enough?
Fabrice, I just want to go back to what Steph was talking about for a moment, so education. So Trans New York, we are doing education, we're doing trainings. Northwell, I'm happy to announce Northwell. We entered into an agreement to them. They're going to train, we are going to train, Stephanie and I and some others at Trans New York, are going to train up to 10,000 of their employees on transgender, non-conforming, non-binary issues. So here's a hospital with health workers who are doing things for the trans communities, but they recognize also with 66,000 employees, it's a lot of employees, and it's a lot of touch points, and they have to get everybody on board. So there are some companies that are doing that. In reference to your next question, and I like to ask this question because, one of the reasons I started Trans New York was because there are many trans organizations across the country that do really, really wonderful work, but they're not as visible as large LGBTQ plus. And I think there's a lot of LGBTQ plus organizations that do wonderful work for trans individuals. But I do think that we need larger trans organizations and more trans organizations with power. If I was to say, who's the largest trans organization in New York, people would be hard pressed to say that, who that one area is. We know trans equality down in Washington, and there are others. But I think that because, as Stephanie mentioned before, that we're seeing more younger people come out earlier, I think as a result that we're going to see some more of these trans organizations becoming larger and becoming stronger and taking up the mantle. And one such hope is Trans New York does that continually. So that's my feeling. I didn't know what the second part of the question was.
Well, do you feel that the LGBTQ organization are doing enough to improve the life of trans people? Their dignity, their opportunities. I mean, it's kind of a trendy topic in the United States, and in a minute we're going to look a little bit beyond the United States. It has been a bit of a trendy topic, but does it really translate into positive change for the type of poverty and marginalization you described, Jen?
Well,
I think if I could just answer, I'll just be quick about it. I think that, it's kind of a loaded question, but I think that there are those that are trying, but clearly, the shape that the transgender community in the answer would be no. I mean, I would have to be a liar to say that that's the way. There are many organizations that are doing wonderful work. I mean, Stephanie was talking about PFLAG.
Thank you.
But I think that, overall, we're a very marginalized group. We need a lot of help. And, currently, it's not for a lack of trying, it's just that there's not enough of it. We'll say that.
And Fabrice, what I would say to tag on to that is, I have to give a shout out to my dear friends and colleagues at PFLAG National. I do sit on the board there. and I'm also the chair of their Business Advisory Council. For those that might be interested, email me. It's 400 chapters from coast to coast, most of whom, if not all, quite frankly, very trans inclusive. It started out PFLAG as Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. Well, it's just PFLAG now, of course, because it's very trans inclusive. And it's part of our commitment to the larger LGBTQ community to be trans inclusive. And I would also, I give a big shout out to PFLAG because we are very much in the forefront of that outreach. Years before I ever was on the board, I would get calls from parents and of trans kids and just trans people in general, it's like, where do I go for support? Well, one of the first places that I would always recommend they go to is, do you have a PFLAG chapter close to you? Let's see if we can find one and go to that chapter, because that's where you'll find community. That's where you'll find support. And then the other one I would say too, Fabrice, is prior to my time on the PFLAG board, I served on the board of the LGBTQ Center of New York City on 13th Street.
Beautiful station.
And they just do amazing, amazing
Yeah.
work at the center. Glenda Testone's a dear friend and an amazing ally. And so that's the other place where support and community for the trans community is happening. You know, clearly I see that, I saw that firsthand at the center, but also at the network of center. You know, CenterLink is a good resource to find the center near you. And that's another place where
I agree. And you know, and sometimes people don't understand the number of services that the centers provide, which is huge. You know, you enter the LGBT center in New York and you have the sheets of paper with all the different sessions every hour that are taking place. And you know, and the other thing is that it is needed because of the number of people that do show up everybody every day for either it's an A meeting or it's a support group or it's a job search help group. There is a lot of really good services that people do use at the center. So I love that, that pitch, Stephanie. And then the other thing about PFLAG is that we haven't talked about it a lot, but a lot of the first hurdles that trans people face is in the family, right? And so that a lot of suffering is happening within the family, and then the workplace is maybe the second place where that has to adapt, but the family is the first place.
That's so true. And that's where, you know, and so more and more what we see in PFLAG is, you know, so many stories of trans kids and the journey that they are beginning with the support of their parents, and what that means for the family unit and for their own growth and their own development. And those are important stories that people need to hear, because you know, there's, you know, those parents and those kids, they're all heroes to me, for embracing their authenticity and having the courage to walk that journey together. And I'm so glad that PFLAG is very close to that, and always will be.
So you know, let's talk for a minute outside of the United States. You know, one thing that struck me a lot when I was working at the World Bank is that a lot of my colleagues had that intuition that, you know, being gay or lesbian was really an American thing, right? An Anglo-Saxon thing. And you know, that good reason to think about it, because they would see gay people all over the place in the US, but they would see very few of them in Estonia or in Vietnam. And so clearly it must be something in the water in the United States that make us gay or lesbian. When really it's about acceptance in society, right? The more accepting society is, the more people come out. So as you know, more people are coming out as trans in the United States because there is some level of basic acceptance that is starting to emerge, right? The more acceptance comes, the more people will be open about their gender identity, that maybe they are actually already living behind closed doors, but they will now live in the public sphere, right? So that leads me to this idea that there is a lot of people in the world that have non-conforming gender identity, but don't express it because the environment is not supportive at all. And so I know that the book, Stephanie, is not yet translated in other languages, but
Only a matter of time, Fabrice. Keep talking, please.
but do you think about the fact that there is, you know, there's such a huge battle overseas, and you know, as a Frenchman, you know, now we are starting to see a few people that emerge in business that are trans, and you know, I've been lucky to work with a few of them in L'Autre Cercle, which is the LGBT group. Some of them are actually now part of the Trans New York Speaker Bureau. So there is a little bit of emergence. But, you know, I love to say that in my country, trans people are a little bit like unicorn. Nobody has ever seen any, and they really believe that it only happened in the US. So my question to you, Stephanie, is do you think a little bit about this, about what's happening outside of the United States, and what can trigger change, first in Europe and then beyond Europe?
Oh, I do. And it's just, it's very interesting overseas because, to your point, Fabrice, it's about, that larger cultural overlay. What are we, what are we dealing with? I've worked with and spoken to a lot of multinational companies. I'd be on these global webinars, and there's Singapore, and there's Hong Kong, and there's India, and there's Brazil, and there's the Netherlands, all in the same call. And it's interesting to hear them talk about what's going on in their own countries. And I think, and it makes the business entity that's operating within that country take on the role of a safe haven for the LGBTQ employee. Because, take for example Singapore, you you as an out trans person, Singapore, not cool. And we know this, and the Singaporeans will be the first to tell you that. But within the company space that you work in, the building in Singapore, you're what happens in that workplace is predicated to a large degree on the rules of that particular workplace, and that particular company. The cultural piece of it, it we have to work through that, I think, because you can walk outside and not be safe, but yet you can come inside and be safe relative to, I would say, the other individuals that you work with that might be national, that might be
Yeah.
native to that country, that might have a different idea
I
about
agree.
who you
Yeah.
are, So
And
that's
think,
the
Stephanie,
challenge, I think.
I think, Stephanie, that's also the power of your experience, is that the corporate world can play a role of an embassy for trans rights abroad.
Absolutely.
And, unfortunately, we are at time. I have to say that this was a fascinating conversation, which is probably why I went over time. And I hope that we can have other conversation on this topic. And in particular, I would love to have conversation with you about the situation in Europe. And we had a great talk recently with Transgender Europe and Jen. And I think, building those bridges is one of the roles that we can play at Out Leadership. But before I thank you and before we close, Stephanie, can you show again the book, and can you tell us how we can access it?
I would love to. Thank you. It is Reflections from Both Sides of the Glass Ceiling, Finding My True Self in Corporate America. And that's what I looked like on my first day of work in November 2005 as myself. The foreword is by my dear, dear friend, Brian Bond, Executive Director of PFLAG National, who also served in the Obama administration, in the Obama White House. It's available for pre-sale everywhere. You can order it on my website, www.stephaniebattolino.com. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thanks, both of you. I love, my questions were a bit difficult. They were a bit personal, and you really played along, and I really appreciate. And Stephanie and Jen, what I love is what you said. That basically you're using the fact that you managed to make it as trans women in society to benefit your sisters abroad, and that's really powerful. And then the other aspect which I love, Jen, is when you said, that we have this common human desire, which is take care of our children, make a living, live in harmony with our family, live in harmony with our community. And I think that's why Trans Day of Visibility is important, is because it shows that we share that humanity, and that therefore, ultimately, when you get to know trans people, you realize that it's extremely unfair, the way society treats them. And so I'm extremely grateful for your time, and I hope we reconnect very soon. Ciao.
Thank you, Fabrice. Thanks for
Bye.
having us. Thank you.
Ciao. See you soon.
Bye-bye.